r/nosleep. Posted by you/pston7. There is no light in heaven. Part 5. Hi friends. Part 1 to 4 video link in description. I think I may just get right into it today. I don't have much to add for my life. As these updates come faster, it gives me less time to accumulate events in my own life that I feel are really worth mentioning. Besides the real lack of anything significant, I really didn't want to post this one. I got this letter after I posted Isaiah's story and I just put it to the side without giving it much thought. It kind of freaked me out a bit for a few reasons. A, there was no return address, which was a bit unsettling, and B, who the hell still sends letters? At first, I thought maybe it was from my husband. I had basically ghosted him after my initial story, so I thought maybe it got lost in the mail, so I opened it. It wasn't. I want to preface this by reiterating, I didn't want to write this one. Since it was a letter, I have no idea if it's real or not sure if any of these are real, but normally I can at least sit and talk to the people. Also, I just generally didn't want to give this person any attention if it is real and they're reading this right now. Anyway, I guess I'll just post the content. As a note too, I'm going to be referring to the author as LW for letter writer. Hello op, he used my real name, which I assume he got from an article that was written about me after the accident. I assume/hope that's how he somehow managed to get my address as well. I truly hope this letter finds you well. I'm sure you're confused and I apologize. I left off the return address in fear that you would see it and shred the letter without reading. I read the account of your death and what you saw, and I have to say, I was skeptical, but I was a fan. The idea of something after death is not something I ever believed or cared about. Even now I wouldn't say I care as much as I am fascinated by it all. I of course was praying that you posted another of your own accounts, but much to my initial dismay you posted that of a gentleman. I was jealous at first, let me tell you. However, when I was able to have my own experience, I knew I needed to find you and write you. Now, I would have been overjoyed to sit down and have a face-to-face with you to discuss, but due to certain circumstances, I assumed you would not be willing, and that is fine, though I do hope to meet you one day. Enough will burying the lead. However, I wanted to at least get through some small background before I introduced myself, just in case you decided to stop reading. My name is LW, you can feel free to Google me if you would like to verify what I say. I did, and I wish I hadn't, so I won't be saying their name here. But I'm not what would be considered a good man. I ran into some trouble with the law and currently find myself in prison. Do I deserve to be here? Maybe, but if I can confess op, I did what I did, for you. I needed to put to test your accounts and see for myself whether or not they were true. I'm an academic by trade, and this is something that needed proper experimentation. So, this wasn't something done on a whim, but simply done for the betterment of humanity and a better understanding of where we are in all of this. Unfortunately, or perhaps, fortunately, as the police were attempting to escort me, let's say, to prison, I fell victim to a few bullets, and that is where my story begins. Now I just want to say I only tell you this to add a layer of legitimacy to my claims, and so you know I'm truthful. I would not lie to you. Let me interrupt here to add a little more background to what was left out of the letter. Like I mentioned, yes, looked him up and I immediately threw up. This man, if it's really him, kidnapped, tortured, and killed 8 people, that they know of. For me, I'm disgusted by him. I'm disgusted and angry at myself for starting any of this shit, and I'm just so sorry to those families that experienced this because of me. I pray that this wasn't actually because of me, and I pray that those can find some peace in the horror that is heaven. I just wanted to say that now so you can understand why I didn't post this sooner and feel sick to my stomach with every word. As for my story, I mentioned the above so we all understand that I was never and am not destined for heaven, though I guess if heaven's that bad then none of us really are. He drew a smiley face here and did this a few times throughout, so I'll just add a smile for him going forward. I'll gloss over this part as it's not the crux of the story, but I thought it was interesting as it hadn't been mentioned by you or the gentleman. After I caught a few bullets, my world shifted from bright and loud and painful, to gray and silent and numb. Being the intellectual that I am, I was able to orient myself quickly and realized I was in fact, standing outside of my body. I put together that I was in fact dead as I watched in a dull amusement as police rushed to my stiff corpse with guns still pointed. As the paramedics pushed the police out of the way, I looked around to take in my surroundings and noticed a familiar looking figure. It was me, or at least a pale version of me, standing motionless away from the chaos of the living world, and without missing a beat I strode over to him, knowing that was what I was meant to do. Again, I don't want to bore you, but he explained that he was my personal reaper. His name escapes me, however. As good as my memory normally is, names are one thing that always elude me, except yours of course. Smile. My reaper explained he was there to lead me to hell for my punishment, which again, was not a surprise after accepting the concept of an afterlife as a whole. I think he may have been taken aback and impressed by how quickly I adapted to my new situation because we simply moved on in silence. I will admit that the journey was pretty cool. We arrived at a sort of bustling, train station-like hub that had dozens or possibly hundreds of souls and their reapers walking around waiting to be taken, presumably to hell as well based on you and the gentleman simply arriving at your destined gates. It didn't take long before I was escorted down through a corridor to a small boat and some sort of creature that demanded payment for us to cross the black water it floated on. Think Karen from mythology, but it was a different entity. Don't worry, I checked. I'm very thorough. My guide produced a gold or perhaps copper coin. I still was seeing the world in a gray shade for the time being, for me to pay the ferryman with and then bid me good luck with my penance. I will note that the journey with the Reaper took a few hours total. I simply rushed through it because I did not think that would be the part of my story that would interest you. But if you would like to hear more about it, you can always write me back. Smile. The one thing that may be of interest to you, however, is he did tell me hell is not permanent. You get tortured based on your sins and spend a number of years before moving on to the paradise that heaven is supposed to be. I will say that up until this point nothing hellish had happened to me, if you ignore the doppelganger Reaper and skeletal ferryman. Besides that, like I mentioned, the water was black and a cool, almost delightful breeze blew inland onto the dock where I stood. I mention that because that changed fairly abruptly. I placed my coin in his outstretched hand and watched it sink into his bony hand with a sickening but curious squelching sound. I stepped onto the small boat and upon the first stroke of his paddle, color exploded back into my life or afterlife as it were. The black water was actually a bright red river that gave off a strong metallic smell. Do with that information what you will. Large gas bubbles filled and exploded near the boat periodically, drenching me and the deck in the thick red liquid. Screams of pain and voices begging for mercy pierced my ears and filled the air around us. The cool breeze was gone and an oppressive, disgusting heat was left in its stead. I'm man enough to admit that I was shaken by this sudden devolution into a more expected hell. There was little I could do except look out over the seemingly endless sea of blood to where it met with the pitch-black horizon. Admittedly, at the time I did not realize how odd it was that I didn't see any other boats around me. There were hundreds of souls waiting to be ferried, but we were all alone, almost. A few minutes into our voyage, it almost sounded like we were running aground. I looked to the ferryman who didn't seem concerned, so shaking and covered in the warm blood I managed to pull myself to the side of the boat to look over into the calm waters to be greeted by rotting hands reaching desperately out of the opaqueness. It was almost pathetic the way they feebly slapped at the wooden hull only to fall back beneath the surface or get run over. I looked along the water towards the front of our boat with a small smirk on my face watching the hands and froze. Around the front weren't hands, but heads bobbing along the surface, their mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for their last breath. They were stained with the blood in which they swam, but you could still see patches of flesh missing from their faces as they decayed. Again, the display was pathetic. They began to bore me, so I went to step back from the edge but froze again. I locked eyes with one of the heads near the front. They were gray and most definitely nearly if not completely blind, but still he stared at me with his gasping mouth and I could almost hear his screams, begging me to end whatever this was. My body began growing hot and the screams all around me faded into the background and all I could hear was this one soul's shrieks of agony. I wanted to look away but I couldn't. Static went through my body as I felt my ears begin to bleed. I tried to scream, but I was paralyzed. It wasn't fear, but some outside force. My vision narrowed around the head and started to fade to black. My chest tightened and my heart threatened to explode or burst through my ribcage. I felt myself slumping forward towards the edge of the boat and knew I couldn't stop myself from falling in and being dragged below. A sickening crunch broke through my trance as I watched the bow of the boat collide violently with the head, all but splitting it in two. The already dead eyes lost what life was left in them as blood and pus leaked from its head and it sank beneath the surface. Admittedly, I immediately vomited into the blood over the side of the boat. I couldn't help it. I tried not to look, but curiosity got the best of me and I scanned the water for any more hands or heads, but they seemed to have all followed each other back to the depths. Shaking, I went and sat behind the ferryman who was still calmly pushing us forward as if nothing had happened. I barely had time to catch my breath when the screaming rocketed back into my ears louder than ever. They were soon joined by high-pitched screeching from above. My gaze shot upward, but I could just barely make out large shadows circling above in the darkness. I held my breath as my heart pounded once again. There was a final shriek and before I knew it the shadows were rapidly flying down towards me. I could barely make out what looked like three heavily distorted women with tattered wings. The claws on their face shredded through my scalp and face with ease. I cried out in pain as I fell to the deck and did what I could to cover my head as they tore into my arms and back. Their shrieks started to mix with playful giggles, but that only seemed to intensify their ferocity. I began swinging my arms wildly, trying desperately to just be able to stand, thinking maybe I could make a run for the bloody river and take my chance with the floaters. As soon as I felt myself fist make contact, the clawing stopped and was replaced by angry yelling in a language I didn't recognize, though I'm fluent in Six Smile. I heard the flapping of wings grow fainter as I remained huddled over for good measure before slowly pushing to my feet, only to fall right back to the deck. The pain was overwhelming as blood trickled slowly into my eyes. I couldn't tell if it was tears or blood running down my face, but when I went to wipe it away with my arm I could see just how much damage was done. My right arm was essentially relieving of its skin as the muscle and tendons were out for the world to see. There was even a little white of bone poking through. I was sure that shock or maybe even fainting would come to momentarily relieve me of the excruciating pain I felt, but I was wrong. I stared in horror at my destroyed arms as pain washed over me in waves, only intensifying as time passed, made even worse with the still bursting bubbles forcing warm blood into my wounds. I couldn't move and could barely even lift my head as the boat came to an abrupt stop and I was flung slightly forward. I lay there, face down on the hardwood, trembling for a moment before something, or five somethings pierced my back and my torso was lifted a few inches above the wood as my legs were dragged behind, gathering splinters as we went. I couldn't even comprehend more pain beyond what I had and just let out a defeated groan as the wood was replaced by jagged, hard stones. I could barely open my eyes enough to see the trail of blood that I was leaving. I coughed out too much blood as more still dripped from my mouth. Feebly, I managed to look up and catch a glimpse of the thing that was dragging me. If I could react then I probably would have at the sight of this ogre. I was a little out of it at the moment, so forgive my crude description, but that's what he was. All he had on was rags covering his disgusting body, but that was all I could make out before my head fell limply back towards the ground. We walked/dragged silently for possibly hours, possibly days, maybe a few minutes, I'm not totally sure as it's really hard to tell time when you would be dead under normal circumstances. But whatever amount of time it was, we eventually reached our destination. I was thrown roughly onto my back on a large stone slab. I groaned in agony as the big slob roughly fastened metal braces around my wrists and ankles, digging into the exposed tissue, and I could feel more blood ooze out as I lay there staring in a daze at the endless blackness that extended above me. I almost let out a smile thinking about those flying creatures coming to get me now. I'm not sure why the thought amused me, but at any rate, the thought was interrupted by me choking slightly on my own blood and having to turn my head and spit to save myself. I turned in time to see the creature lumbering away into the darkness, and I was alone, thrust into complete silence after his clumsy footsteps faded. I let my head settle back onto the hard stone, shuddering slightly when the wounds on my head touched the surface. I was left there for, again, an undetermined amount of time, my body shaking slowly and constantly fading to the edge of consciousness before the searing pain brought me back. Blood still trickled out of my broken body, and between you and me, I don't think I should have had any blood left at that point, but that's neither here nor there. My slow descent into madness sitting there in silence was interrupted by movement. It took me a second in my state to realize I was moving. My stone slab was righting itself until I was dangling upright by my wrists and ankles still. The braces dug deeper into me because of my weight fighting against them. I think I gritted my teeth, but in all honesty, the additional pain was fairly inconsequential. But, out of the darkness slank a man. Just an ordinary man. He was maybe my height, which I won't reveal because I'm not sure if that's something that matters to you. Smiles, super pale, and sporting a funky beard to go with his pitch black hair and bright white suit. He just stood there smiling at me. It was almost warm. I immediately started to feel a little better, and I think the constant blood flow from my wounds slowed and possibly even stopped. The man silently circled around me with his hands behind his back before settling back in front of me, his warm smile still on his face. From behind his back he pulled a glass of copper-colored liquid and brought it to my lips. I didn't really have a choice as he began pouring it down my throat. A pleasant warmness ran through me, and just like that I could focus again. My body was numb rather than in pain, and I was able to look to my arms and saw the skin reforming rapidly over my exposed muscle. I let out an excited laugh and little squeal of joy as I looked back to my savior. His smile never left, but it struck me differently. Maybe it was because I was finally lucid, or maybe it had indeed changed, but it wasn't joyful and warm. There was something sinister behind it. My body grew cold. Ambrosia is an incredible thing for humans, he said evenly, never taking his eyes off mine. For me, just delicious. For you, well, you saw what it can do. He gestured to my limbs. I refused to speak. I could tell he was trying to figure me out, or at least psych me out, so I gave him a knowing smile and his sinister one deepened. He licked his lips and walked into the darkness as he asked, "Do you fancy yourself a smart man, LW?" I still didn't respond as he wheeled in a small metal table covered as rusty, definitely pre-used tools. He looked at me amused. "It's okay if you don't want to talk, That's not what this is about. He returned to his table and after a second of deliberation chose a long thin knife. He lifted it and examined it before nodding approvingly and slowly making his way over to me with the knife clasped between his hands behind his back. "I don't expect that you know who I am," he said with a small hopefully look, but when I didn't respond he just sighed and I saw his smile falter slightly. "That's okay, I don't think my name is one that's used very much where you're from." He leaned in close, looking me up and down with curiosity before nodding slightly and thrusting the blade into my gut and leaving it there. I left out a small scream but bit my tongue, which made him smile. "Wonderful." He patted me softly on the cheek and turned back to his tools. I could feel my body moving around the blade and it slowly widened the hole. I tried to remain still as best I could and try not to focus on the blood beginning to once again trickle out of me. "Why did you even heal me?" I managed to wheeze out as I vomited up a small amount of blood. He spun around a little faster than expected, but then I think realized and collected himself and chose another tool before answering. "A few reasons." He cleared his throat and made his way over to me, studying the spiked hammer that he now held. "I don't think it's very fair to me if you make it all the way here and you're already bloody and broken, then what's my job?" He chuckled warmly and then brought the hammer down on my hand. I could feel and hear the bones crunching beneath the force and the world went fuzzy for a second. "Second, as I asked before and already know, I think you think of yourself as a smart man, maybe better than those around you." He brought the hammer down on my other hand, "and I don't fucking like that, because you're not. You're just another pathetic bag of flesh that ended up with me. Cast down." Again he swung. Up here, I'm going to skip ahead a bit because most of the next few pages is describing in vivid detail the amount of torture he endured and didn't really do much to progress the story. Essentially LW was tortured for hours, the man would leave him alone to suffer and then return to repeat the process. After a few rounds of this he was given more ambrosia and then they started from step 1. It was days of this back and forth before he began talking to me meaningfully again. "LW," he began despondently as he sliced a piece of skin from my forearm. "I lied when I said it didn't matter that you don't know me." He sighed and looked in my eyes, almost defeated. "I was thinking maybe after a week together I could loosen your tongue to see if you were lying to me too, but alas I think you don't know me." He talked as he continued to fillet my arm. "I'm kind of important around here, kind of the big bad if you will." He stopped slicing and looked me in the eyes. "Avarisha." I could tell he was expecting me to have some reaction to that and when I just shrugged his eyes glowed red and his skin seemed to crack and I could almost make out some red below the surface. He took a breath and returned to normal. "I fucking knew it. Everyone knows Satan, right? Fucking Lucifer gets plenty of credit but God for fucking bid the guy who runs the show gets any love. Even fucking Behemoth. Nope, never mind, whatever, it's fine." He was clearly rattled and angry. This sent a shiver down my spine. For the week he spent torturing me he was calm and collected. Everything he did was almost clinical and matter of fact, but now, who knows? He took a breath to collect himself, but then violently thrust the knife into my gut repeatedly before turning and launching it into the darkness, letting out a scream of frustration. Without a word he stormed to the tools and grabbed a corkscrew, which was new. He stomped back over with a look of fury on his face and brought the tip to about an inch from my eye. I closed my eyes and shook uncontrollably, but he grabbed my eyelid and opened it, forcing me to look at the sharp tool. "Do you think this is bad, LW? You haven't fucking seen anything. I only come down here to play with truly special guests and I'm still not the worst you'll fucking see." His hot breath stung my face. But suddenly he smiled and drew back a little. "Did the Reaper tell you about your penance?" I nodded meekly and his smile grew wider. "Penance is real, heaven is real. Heaven is the next stop, after a few hundred years of us playing together of course. You get to go, nothing I can do about that, but I wouldn't want to anyway. You think I'm bad? Heaven's a lie. There's shit up there that I'm afraid of." He pulled back completely and laughed. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "My brothers and sisters are going to tear you apart, and you know the best part? It's forever. You're dead. You just keep going back to get torn apart again and again and again forever." The joy was back on his face and though psychology isn't my field of science, I think it was cathartic for him to let this out. I knew I had to ask just for myself, not knowing if I would be back to write you, but at this point I needed to know. "Elysium," I whispered. He laughed. "What?" I managed to look him in the eye. "Elysium," I said a little more forcefully. His laughter grew and then stopped abruptly and he was on top of me in the blink of an eye with the corkscrew back in its place. "Elysium? Not sure how you know about that, but it doesn't matter. It's gone. Wiped out, like the rest. You can't escape, there is no heaven." He smiled as he drew the corkscrew back, preparing to laugh it forward. "Our next 100 years are going to be Elysium compared to what's waiting for you," He laughed as he thrust his arm forward. I closed my eyes and turned my head desperately, waiting for the pain, but none came. I opened my eyes in a hospital, handcuffed to the bed. They had saved me apparently, why I don't know. But I was dead for give or take 2 minutes. Now I know what you're thinking, you were also dead for 2 minutes and spent a few hours in heaven, but 2 minutes in hell was over a week. I hypothesize it's just a way to prolong the torture and delay entrance to heaven, but of course I can't be sure. Now to the reason I wrote you. Besides being a fan smile, my demon or whatever he claimed to be of course mentioned Elysium, and I'm glad I asked so I could bring this back for you. Though it was just a small mention in the gentleman's story, I felt it important. However, we can take him at his word and trust that a demon was telling the truth and there really is no salvation, or we can assume he was trying to further crush my spirits. I'm not an optimist but you make me want to believe that we'll find each other one day in the Elysium field safe and sound and live out our eternity together. Whatever the case, I hope we can figure this out together. Smile. I patiently await your response. Love. LW. So. I'm sick to my stomach transcribing that. I tried to spare the gorier details, but felt what I added was necessary to understand him. I don't know what to think at this point. LW and I share one thing, we're not optimists, so I'm inclined to take the demon at his word. Oh, and by the way, I looked up Avarisha and it's a little sketchy, but I think he's technically a devil, not a demon. Not sure if that means anything or is in any way relevant, I just thought it needed to be clarified. In any case, I hope you understand why I didn't want to post this update and why I eventually did. This definitely didn't make me feel any better about our futures, but I have a call with someone tomorrow who said they have something I'll want to hear, and the email seemed excited and stable, so hopefully we have some good news coming our way. I'll update in the next couple days, but until then, continue your planning. Those who are planning, and everyone, please stay safe. Also PS, even if Elysium is real, I'm not fucking meeting with LW in the afterlife. There is no light in heaven. Part 6/final. Hi, this is tough for me, but as the name suggests, this is going to be my last update. In my previous one I promised a pretty quick turnaround, but anyone who's been with me since the beginning should have known that wasn't coming. In all honesty, I wasn't going to post again, but I felt like I owed it to anyone reading to at least give some closure to my stories. Before I get into it, I'm going to answer the biggest question that I've gotten asked through comments and DMs, and that being why it took me so long to post a part 3, as it was almost 2 years after part 2. I've been intentionally vague with who I am and specifics of my life, besides literally being married, for a reason, but let's just say there were more out there like LW who became interested in me after reading my story. They were unfortunately not in jail and a little more aggressive with getting to know me better. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Maybe I'll tell the story someday, who knows, but I'm not ready for that. But those people caused me and my family a lot of issues for the past couple of years. I didn't think they were really relevant, but now I see they were. Other than that, yes, I did spend a lot of the time talking to people and traveling when I could to gather these stories and many more like them, and one day I'd love to share those as well, if only to give a voice to the others who've suffered. But until the time comes that I write them all down, I think I just need to live my life and distance myself as much as I can from them, for my own sanity. That all being said, let's get into it. I mentioned that I had a phone call about something I'll want to hear. Well, the call was actually to just set up a flight for me to meet someone. I was confused and a little annoyed as to why this couldn't be done over the phone, but whatever, it was a free flight and they allowed me to take my husband, so it seemed like maybe a mini vacation, even though the flight was only about an hour. Again, I don't want to give too many details for my safety and for the privacy of the man we were going to meet, but it was a private flight which was fucking awesome, and we had a car waiting for us at the airfield that took us to this insane house. I won't go any further than that, just that I was feeling better and better about this, and having my husband with me meant the world. I squeezed his hand tight as well, made our way up the giant driveway through the gates, and couldn't take the stupid big grin off my face when I saw a man standing at the door waiting for us. We got out as 2 more men ran out of the house to grab our luggage. I went to shake the man's hand, but he simply bowed. "Please follow me, sir and miss, and I will take you to your meeting before showing you to your rooms. Master is very excited to meet you." I was a little taken aback, thinking this was the man I was meant to meet, as he was definitely the one I spoke with on the phone, and he never mentioned being a butler or servant or whatever. I was beginning to grow a bit tense at the situation, but my husband's hand on my back reassured me as we followed the man through the insane halls. Oh, and just as a note, he wasn't as rude as I'm writing. He knew mine and my husband's name and said them, including his and his boss's, but I was asked not to use their names and won't give out mine. We made our way up a set of stairs, and after another long hall came to the most expensive looking door I've ever seen. The butler opened it to reveal a bed with a man laying stiffly. I thought for a moment that he was dead as he looked frail and weak, but as I looked at the machines he was hooked up to, a computerized voice welcomed us to his home. A little shocked, I turned to the man who almost had a smile on his face, but not quite. "Please don't be alarmed by my appearance. I wasn't quite so lucky as you to be revived so quickly following my ordeal, leaving me unable to speak, and the accident itself took care of the rest of my movements." I moved closer to the bed, nodding and giving my apologies. "And yes, I realize this intro is taking a bit longer than usual, so let me power through here." Basically, he explained his accident, not to get into specifics, but he obviously had major damage to his spine and was dead for about 11 minutes before being resuscitated. As he put it, not the longest someone's come back from, but plenty of time to permanently damage my brain and lose my ability to speak. He uses some experimental device that, tracks his brain waves and translates them or something. I'm not sure, it sounded technical and like rich people shit, but he was having a conversation without actually speaking, so, sure. Anyway, my husband went to leave the room to give us some privacy, but the man wanted him to stay there for me, which was odd and not just a little bit off-putting. So now, tense and a little scared, we sat next to the bed and he began. "I read the first few of the posts that you made before reaching out. Thinking, you either didn't need my story or maybe you were lying or something, I don't know. But there ended up being too many similarities to what I saw and experienced for it to be a lie. I was notified of your latest post after you already agreed to come, and after reading it I knew I made the right decision. After the accident, as you know, I was placed in some ethereal place, but unlike you and the others, there was no mist around my feet or rocky surface or podium waiting to greet me. My gait was golden and intact. I say there was no mist, but there was some calming haze in the air. Like it was just getting to be morning in a beautiful, untouched scene of nature. I'm not afraid to admit that I broke down crying tears of joy. I fell to my knees into the softest grass you could ever imagine and looked on through the already open gate to see the grassy plain stretch on infinitely. I sat there for maybe an hour, honestly, just feeling the grass under my hands and the gentle breeze almost whispering to me, but I never felt the force you had to go through the gate. I decided to lay on my back and closed my eyes, letting my mind wander with happiness. As relaxation and joy took hold of me, the whispers became more clear, and the word Elysium was so clear, like it was the word I had been waiting to hear my entire life, even though I didn't know what it was. I finally pushed myself to my feet, and with a couple satisfied breaths to fill my lungs with the pristine air, I walked through the gate. Almost immediately something was wrong. That joy and warmth and everything I felt was gone. I didn't feel dread or fear or pain, I didn't feel anything. The whispering wind was gone and the haze felt less like a comforting blanket and more ominous, like I was waiting for something to jump out even though it was clear enough for me to see to the horizon, or I was waiting for it to suffocate me. That thought started to stick with me as I looked around, longing for anything and getting nothing. I spent a good hour walking around in silence before I saw anything, and at first all I saw were what I can only describe as mirages. Shimmering shadow-like images. At first it was ghost-like people who were just wandering around, probably looking exactly like I did, but when I would try to call out or run towards them to interact, they would just fade away back into the haze. I started to attribute it to the oppressive loneliness of the area, but then other figures started to emerge from the haze in the same way. I saw these shimmering transparent creatures that I could barely make out, who at first wandered like the people. Eventually they looked like they were attacking something that I couldn't see, but again they didn't seem to realize I was there. I can't even go about describing what exactly they were, but I think I saw at least two of the things you saw, the minotaur-esque fellow and the leading bat creature. I didn't see the children or the long, clawed creature that our friend Polly saw, and of course didn't get a glimpse of William's fish creature, but I did also get a clear view of the panther-like thing the older gentleman described. The name of which I don't remember, but I don't even think this device could pronounce it if I did. More than anything at this moment, all I felt was confusion and loneliness. I wasn't necessarily afraid, I was just getting anxious. These visions were scratching an itch in the back of my head, but almost as quickly as they came they left. This went on for about an hour total, and all I could do was keep walking. Actually, at that moment it didn't even occur to me to stop moving forward. Anyway, after that hour or so was up, the people were back along with the creatures this time, and to my horror I could see the creatures tearing through the terrified people who tried in vain to flee for their lives. There was still no sound from the scenes, and they just seemed like memories that were replaying in front of me. But that almost made it worse, because as I mentioned, they were scratching an itch, but unfortunately itches tend to pop up elsewhere when you scratch one. I realized I was almost straining myself to make out anything from these scenes that were playing out around me, but still there was nothing. I just calmly walked through the middle, unaffected, as people were brutally torn apart around me. And then I heard this roar. It cut through the haze and the silence like a nuke and made me stop in my tracks. I spun around desperately trying to find the source, and before long I realized all the movement around me had stopped. The people were gone, Except for what was left of their bodies on the ground. Maybe that was all that was left, I really don't know. But the creatures all had stopped and turned their attention toward me. A shiver ran through me as I resumed at a quicker pace this time. None of them moved except to follow me with their heads, and after a few seconds I took off at a run. The creatures still didn't move, but another roar ripped through the silence, almost knocking me off my feet and causing me to stumble for a moment. I turned as I ran to see one of the creatures chasing behind me and gaining fast. It galloped on all fours, and as it closed the ground between us I could barely start making it out because of its hazy figure, but it looked like, well, for lack of a better description, have you ever seen Lord of the Rings? It looked like the Balrog. Honestly, I don't want to sit here and make that comparison, but it's true. 40 feet tall with the curved horns and flames emanating from it. I couldn't quite make out the color, but I could faintly see red exploding through the cracks in its skin, and I don't need to tell you, but it had tiny black wings that couldn't hold up a flower. I tried desperately to go faster, but I knew it was no use. I looked back ahead to concentrate on where I was going, but I knew there was nowhere to hide in the endless open fields. The creature was silent behind me until it let out one last roar directly behind my head, and I was thrust forward and landed hard face down, just not on the soft grass. I could feel my face bleeding and cut, my hands and arms were skinned and blood trickled from them as well. I shakily lifted my head to see the haze had turned into a thicker, green smog. The bright green grass was replaced by a black stone ground that had red cracks littered around where the smog was billowing from. I tried my best to keep my head below the thicker collection of smog that hovered a few feet from the ground, but the air around me was still full of a thinner layer that choked me and burned my eyes. The air or smog was hot, and I could see boils starting to form on my exposed arms. I tried to crawl with my eyes closed tight, coughing as I went, and the smell of death and burning meat exploded into my nose. I gagged and threw up, finally opening my eyes to try to get my bearings. I squinted to avoid getting as much of the smog in my eyes as I could, but I was still barely able to make out the shadows of more of those creatures walking through the smog unaffected, dragging screaming people behind them. I saw body parts littering the ground around me and had to keep myself from vomiting again or screaming and alerting whatever the heck was out there. But it was no use, I should have known. I felt myself forcibly turned onto my back by a creature whose figure extended up above the smog, so I couldn't quite make anything out above a few feet. But they had these large black webbed talons that ended at a collection of blood-covered black feathers, and I could see little snake or leech-like creatures coiling their way through the feathers. A rusty hook swung down out of the smog and lodged itself in my leg, shattering my shin bone in the process. I let out a scream of pain and heard a deep laugh from the creature, but I was more focused on more of the leech-like things that were making their way down the chain of the hook and then the hook itself. I held my breath as they reached my skin and without hesitation burrowed their way into my leg, using the newly opened wound as entrance. I was too shocked to scream, but pain shot through my body as they, I assume, began to eat my leg. The scream got caught in my throat as the creature began to finally move, dragging me along the jagged ground. The back of my head bounced repeatedly on the stone and my vision began to blur and then recover and then repeat. All the while I could feel the leeches wriggling through my leg, feasted on my calf. I struggled to keep my eyes open through the smog but could faintly make out hands reaching out of the cracked ground, almost trying to grab any dragging bodies they could. It took me a second, but I realized we had just about fallen in line with a dozen or so more creatures who all had poor souls snared on the ends of their hooks. Most of the victims were screaming or crying their heads off, and just about all of them looked to be in worse shape than myself. I glanced at the person next to me and had to immediately look away. He was one of the few silent ones, and I could tell why, as giant versions of the slithering creatures covered his face and left bloody trails as they went in and out of any hole they could find on his head. I was only dragged for a few minutes until I was hoisted up through the smog into clear night air above. I let out a scream as the hook dug deeper into my bone. Now that I was above the smog, I could see the damage that the leech things had done as they started poking out of my skin and blood poured down to my torso. I caught a brief glimpse of the thing that had dragged me as it hung me upside down against a stone wall of some sort that I'm not sure how I missed. It had the lower half of a bird and the nude upper half of a woman with more black feathers adorning its back and a grotesque mix between an beak and mouth. She just walked away though, and it was almost as if we hadn't just spent that extremely painful time together. I looked around slowly, trying my best to shove the pain down to see a dozen or so other bodies hanging by their hooks as their respective bird thing was walking away as if they never existed. We only hung for long enough for me to get those glimpses around me, however, before a body a few down from me was suddenly jerked up and over the top of the wall and was gone. It happened so fast I would have missed it if not for the small yelp the person let out. Over the groans and cries of the souls around me, I could barely make out a scream, an impact, and then a loud squelching and a thump as something heavy and wet hit the ground. This was followed by a low growl and another scream and impact. The next body in the line was the one covered in the leeches. He never even made a sound, But still there was the impact, heavy sound and low grumble, but no scream or last impact. Then it was the next body, and the next and one more. Then it was my turn. I closed my eyes in anticipation before feeling myself flying up and slamming my head hard on the stone as I was pulled over the top of the wall and onto a flat ground. It was like we were hanging over the side of a building and were now on top. After a moment of nothing, I opened my eyes to see the Balrog creature sitting on a giant throne-like chair in front of me. Heat radiated off of the massive creature as it looked at me with almost a bored expression. It rested its elbow on the side of the black stone chair and rested its massive head on its fist. It didn't make a sound, just looked at me as if I was interrupting its day. A squishing sound attracted my attention to my left and I shot my gaze over to see two of the bird creatures leaning over the fully taken over leech guy, or at least what was left of his body, as they brought bloody cleavers down over his limbs, chopping them off before all that was left was his head, which they just kicked over the side of the landing. I was shaking uncontrollably as they loaded his body parts into a giant bloody basket that they then placed at the foot of the Balrog's chair, but he didn't acknowledge it. Two more of the creatures then came over and one carried another cleaver with them. I tried to jump up and run, but as soon as I moved, pain shot through my leg from where the hook had secured itself in me. The birds knelt down near my legs and I begged and cried as they brought the cleaver down repeatedly onto the thigh of my leech-riddled leg until it fell free and I was left sobbing on my back as I felt the blood pour out of me. I managed to open my eyes and wipe away my tears for long enough to see the cleaverless bird slowly walk my leg to the Balrog and present it to him. I could see the leeches wriggling from my bloody limb and could almost hear them screaming. The Balrog let out that low growl I had been hearing and without moving his head from his hand reached down with his other hand to pinch the leg between two fingers and then in one motion popped it into its mouth. It took a second to chew and then turned its head and spit out the limb, shaking its head with a disappointed gaze. I whimpered as the bird that remained behind nodded swiftly and began rolling me towards the edge of the landing, opposite that of the now just head of the man. He kicked me off and after a second or so of falling I hit the ground hard. I was able to barely push myself off of my stomach and onto my back. I had fallen directly on my face and my nose was for certain broken and maybe a few ribs to go with my now lack of a leg. I looked around me and the air was oddly clear as it had been above the smog. I was curious, but that curiosity was immediately turned into dread as I realized we were surrounded by 4 pitch black walls that extended up about 30 feet all around us. As I took in my new prison I heard the low growl again and looked up to see another one-leg body coming tumbling over the edge. I was just barely able to roll out of the way in time as the woman hit the ground with a disgusting splat. I forced myself to my butt to sit against the stone wall shaking and crying. I heard what sounded like a tiger somewhere off in one of the dark corners, followed by a few screams of pain and tearing sounds. I cried harder and heard the low growl and seconds later another splat, but I didn't look. Every now and then one of the bird creatures would swoop down and peck at the bodies of those who weren't moving. I'd say they were dead, but at the time I didn't know if you could die again. If a bird wanted a meal to go they'd swoop down and fly a screaming soul out of the pit to God knows where. Not entirely sure how they were flying though, because though they had feathers they still had human arms and didn't even have those little black wings. Growl. Squish. As I sat, the ground in front of me rumbled and opened slightly. A wisp of smog escaped and then dissipated. Growl. No squish. They must have gotten rolled to the other side. Who knows what was over there? Out of the hole slithered a giant version of the leech things. At this size I could see the round hole in its head, I won't even call it a mouth, that was filled with rows of razor-sharp, jagged teeth. It squished its way slowly towards me and I'm afraid to say I froze in fear and couldn't do anything as it reached my remaining leg and began to suck my entire limb into its slimy body. I let out a cry of pain as the razor-like teeth tore through my flesh and the fluids inside. The creature burned what was left as the teeth were finished tearing. At that point I was completely paralyzed and just had to watch as this thing made its way up my body. I realized to my horror as it reached my waist that the entire body of the thing wasn't even out of the pit that it had created. As it began tearing its way through the lower half of my torso I could feel blood starting to trickle from my mouth and the world around me began to fade away. That's when I woke up back on Earth. Not sure if the creature had finished me up and I spent the next few hours being disgusted or something, or if I had been revived before it finished the job, but that's all I saw up there. Me and my husband just sat in a stunned silence staring at our storyteller. I wanted to say something but there was nothing that could be said. He had his hand on mine for most of the story, but removed it now and just looked at the floor. I had looked to see his face a few times throughout and I think hearing another first-hand account had really gotten to him, which I understood. "I'm sorry," was all the man said after a few minutes of silence. We sat in our room of the man's house that night without speaking a word to each other. My husband's expression hadn't changed since the story was finished, and I didn't know what to say to him, so I just sat next to him on the edge of the bed, silently crying. After an hour of sitting in the darkness, he gave me a hug and I broke down. Everything I had been hoping for, everything I had been searching for in these fucking stories was a lie. I spent so much of my time left trying to find answers to questions I don't know if I should have asked. I should have stuck with training or given myself false hope that Elysium was out there. That there was some heaven left. I wanted that for us, for all of us. To have some sliver of fucking hope left, and I took that from everyone. I'm sorry for writing this. I'm sorry for starting any of this. It makes me wonder if blissful ignorance would have been better for all. I'll say it again, this is my last post. I'm going to travel and enjoy my time with my family. If there's one thing I learned from this, it's that it is better if faced with those you care about, and spending time with them and loving them is the most important thing we can do. I don't mean for this to get sappy, there's just nothing else left. I hope to collect and share the rest of the stories I've gathered and the rest of my personal story somewhere someday, but I can't right now. For those of you with me from the beginning, I genuinely appreciate the advice and the love, and I hope to see some of you on the other side. But for everyone regardless, good luck. My job is to guide others to the afterlife. I guess I'll start by saying hi. I haven't really communicated with multiple people in a long time, so I'm a little unsure how to go about it, but my name's Dux, and as the title suggests, I'm what's called a Reaper. There's two tiers of Reapers. One is the one most of you may be familiar with, the traditional Grim Reaper, where a soul dies and the Reaper comes in to ferry it to heaven or hell, and the second one, the one I am, is the lower tier. Essentially, I live my life as a human would, but every couple weeks I have to guide a soul who was taken before their time. I'll explain what this means more in a bit, but basically some are chosen to meet their eternity early. Basically, a soul can become a Reaper after they die and repent. I myself died right near the turn of the 20th century and have been at this for about 100 years now. After 200 I'll get bumped up to tier 2, and if you're confused by my less than traditional name, Reapers get to choose their own name after their first ferry, and I chose Dux, which means leader. I thought it was fitting, but I digress. Back to the point. In tier 1 the souls aren't dead yet, but they have the choice to face a series of trials to get into heaven or hell. The reason I'm writing this post is because of my last ferry. In my 100 years of ferrying I've only had about 36 souls. Like I said, this is a very rare opportunity for souls, but this one was my youngest, and something about it has stuck with me, and I needed for someone to read this so that they know what's possible, and maybe if you're one of the lucky chosen then you can be prepared, or you at the very least know to turn back. Abraham had just turned 14. I don't know why he was chosen so early. If I had it my way this wouldn't even be an option, but I don't have a choice. I was placed with Abe, so the calling had to begin. It starts with dreams a few weeks before it's time. The soul will start hearing their Reaper's voice calling out to them. It's faint and really not noticeable at first when they're awake, but it drowns out their dreams for days. Eventually their mind can make sense of the Enochian, and that's when it takes a turn. As soon as they make the translation, the gentle calls of their name turn into sounds of hell, and their dreams are overtaken by what could possibly await them. I always try to yell over the screams a simple mantra: the path to darkness is paved with gold, but paradise lies beyond pain. But I really don't know if it ever makes it through, and the fact that before Abe I only had 4 people make it to heaven makes me think it doesn't. During this time a Reaper starts to connect with their soul. Essentially we start to feel what they're feeling. Pain, joy, fear, really whatever they feel I start to feel. This helps us sympathize further, and, allegedly, this is supposed to help more souls make it to heaven, but again 4 have, so I think it's bullshit. Anyway, this will go on for weeks until the soul is finally ready. By ready I mean they can barely sleep or function in general out of fear from the nightmares they're experiencing and the voices they're hearing throughout the day now. I hate that it comes to that, but eventually we can bring them to the path. Abe went to sleep that last night with peace. I could feel his bliss as he was finally able to rest his head on his pillow and listen to nothing but silence. As soon as they fall asleep I usually summon them, but I let Abe rest. It broke my heart that I had to bring him, and I really wanted him to enjoy the last bit of peace that he ever might experience. Eventually I relented and brought him to the path. I stood at the entrance to the path as Abe stood with his back to me. I could instantly feel his fear more intense than ever. I felt fear that I hadn't ever experienced from a soul. He shivered and shook violently from the freezing cold around us and his panic at standing alone in the pitch black. I looked at my own hands and realized I had started slightly shaking as well, which was odd. I looked back at him with curiosity and snapped my fingers. Suddenly the path fully opened and the clearing we were standing in was bathed in light and warmth. I watched his shoulders relax and immediately felt his fear diminish. It wasn't gone, but it was lessened for the time being. I tried to hold back a smile, but I couldn't. As he turned, I could feel his joy rise, and then the fear was back like never before. This was a normal step. Reapers take on the form of whatever soul they're in charge of at the time. Again, this is supposed to make the transition easier or something, but I know when I saw my Reaper it was the most terrifying moment of my life or afterlife. I kept the smile on my face to try and project a feeling of calm to the boy, but the connection's only one way. I beckoned for him to join me, but he didn't move. Understandable. The fear I was feeling through Abe made my smile waver, but I fought through it as he floated towards me. This is something we have to do sometimes, and if any of you ever experience this, it's nothing to be ashamed of. This is a scary moment, and sometimes your legs just don't want to work. The way he kept eye contact with me while he floated was new though, and a little off-putting. I could feel that even with his fear he was a strong kid and was trying to maintain that on the outside, ready for anything I was about to throw at him. It gave me fleeting confidence in that moment. He had no idea what was waiting. When Abe was about 3 feet from me, he was lowered back to the ground. I gave him a second to run through the gambit of emotions that were normal for the situation and felt each one with him. He pushed right through disbelief and horror and settled almost immediately on dread. Again, my smile fell momentarily as I shook from the strength of what he was feeling. I shook it off and cleared my throat. Hello, Abraham. My name is Dux. I have the honor of being your guide on the final path. You may ask me anything you like. Abraham didn't move. I could feel the tears coming before I saw them. Final path? He stammered. I nodded slowly. I'm only 14. I tried to maintain a cheery look, but had to blink my eyes to maintain composure. Yes, you haven't lived a long life, but some are given early release from the mortal plane to gain the chance to live forever in paradise. Congratulations. I know it sounds so stupid and cliché, but I let the words hang in the air and felt him go through emotions so quickly I could barely feel them before the next one was there. That being said, you can end this right now and go back to your life. Abe looked up at me with curiosity and confusion. You pass these trials and you make it to heaven. If you don't, you don't. Or you can take your chance with life and hope everything works out in your favor. This new information sent his mind into overdrive. For a young kid, he weighed the pros and cons with a level of maturity that most older souls don't even have. He stood there in external silence for a while. I went to say something else, but he interrupted me. Let's fucking go. He said it with such force that I couldn't help but smile. This kid was infectious, and I think I knew why he was chosen for this. I reached out my hand and after some hesitation led him through the trees behind me. We walked in silence and I felt him trying to get a hold of his nerves. What's the first test? He finally asked. The first one is relatively easy, I said while keeping my eyes straight ahead. This is also the only one I can help you on. Do not look at anyone in this test. If you have to close your eyes, close them, I don't care, just don't look anyone in the eyes. Abe gulped, almost regretting asking the question, and continued in silence until we came upon a split in the path. We've reached our first decision. Would you like to forego the tests, I said, gesturing to the left path that had a bright golden glow to it, or would you like to endure? I finished, waving my hand towards the right path that was shrouded in darkness. Faint moans could be heard through the black. Again, don't get on me about the cheese, it's stuff I have to say. Let's test it, Abe said after a breath. I smiled, hoping desperately that he could feel me trying to be reassuring. The left path dimmed and we continued to the right. I left Abe in the darkness and moved to the end of the trial. I could see and feel everything he endured during each trial, and I shook with his nervousness. Good luck, I yelled to him as the darkness lifted around him. Abe's head immediately shot towards the sky, and at first I could feel confidence start to take over. But then the test actually began. As soon as he took a step, the air around him erupted into pained moans. I watched as the figures that I knew to be damned souls swarmed around him aimlessly. They weren't going to do anything, unless he looked at them, hence my warning. He froze immediately and I could feel the fear start to grab hold. I silently cheered him on, and eventually he took a deep breath and started moving again. It took all I had to not start cheering for the kid. I saw him bump off a few of the souls and stop each time, consumed by fear. Basically have a script. As expected, Abe stood in silence, so I cleared my throat again and continued. I'm what's called a Reaper. I was once human and I wasn't given this same opportunity, so you truly are getting something special. With that I could actually manage a real smile. Abe's spirits lifted for a second when he heard he was special, and it lifted the weight sitting on me for a moment. That moment crumbled as Abe fell to his knees in tears. But I don't want to go. I'm only 14. I reached a shaking hand out to touch his shoulder, but Abe pulled away. I don't want to go. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. Most of my souls are middle-aged or older and I can suppress their feelings easily. The one time I needed to maintain composure to calm this child and I couldn't. I took my time to collect myself. I understand. Again, I wasn't given this opportunity. I just died young and became a reaper to save myself from the darkness. This is a way for you to avoid the darkness. Abe sniffed and tried to compose himself. If I have to do this, what do I have to do? I could feel that strength bubble to the surface again. His confidence was at war with his fear, and an involuntary smile spread across my face. It's not going to be easy, I began, but you'll endure a series of tests, and depending on how you face them, you will be placed in paradise or be thrown to the darkness. After each test you can continue or leave. The choice is yours. Abe took a couple breaths before responding. What kind of tests? I sighed. They get progressively worse. I can't say exactly what they are, but it's not going to be easy. Like I said, there is an exit after every one. Close your eyes. I accidentally said out loud. I looked around quickly and then realized I'm always alone during these trials, so are there even rules? I wasn't even sure he heard me until he stopped a final time and closed his eyes. He brought his head down to face forward, and I could feel his immediate relief as looking up was beginning to strain his neck. I took a deep breath and started feeling a bit better myself. He shook slightly as the moans grew louder as more souls filtered in from the trees and aimlessly wandered around him. He gulped and put out his hands and began on his way again. He made his way through at a painfully slow pace, but as long as he made it through, the timing didn't matter. He eventually made it past the mass of bodies, and I could feel his fear start to dissolve as the moans most likely were starting to die away the further he went. When he was about 100 yards from the end of the path, he stopped. I didn't know what was going on, but all of a sudden his eyes shot open. My heart dropped as he stared in my direction in confusion. He can't see me or anything beyond this trial until it's complete, so when he opened his eyes, all he saw was darkness at the end. I could feel his confusion turn to panic as he started frantically looking around, thankfully just side to side at first, but then to my horror he turned around. He grew completely still and couldn't even shake from terror when he saw the grotesque, humanish figures that he had just passed through bumping into each other and slowly moving back and forth. I don't blame the kid, as the naked wrinkly skinned creatures still give me the creeps after all this time. I held my breath and was frozen from his fear as one of the souls met Abe's eyes. The moaning stopped and the horde turned in his direction in unison. Time seemed to freeze as everyone stood motionless. As soon as Abe took a step back, the horde let out horrifying screams and began to stream towards him at an unbelievable pace. To his credit, Abe didn't let his crippling fear slow him down as he turned and sprinted in my direction with everything he had. I could feel his desperation and looked from him to the horde that was rapidly gaining ground and back again. I could hear his panting and realized I was panting myself as I started screaming for him to hurry. Fuck the rules. The leading souls reached out and barely grazed his shirt as he got about 25 yards from me. I was all but reaching out my hand at this point. A chill went through my body as one of the souls dove and grabbed him around the ankle, throwing him forward. His top half of his torso landed out of the trial and he looked up at me with panic, pleading with his eyes even though he was too afraid to speak. I hesitated for a split second too long and the horde began dragging the child back into the trial. He kicked violently and let out a heart-wrenching scream as the skin was starting to get torn from his calves. That was enough for me to reach down and drag the kid the rest of the way. As soon as his feet crossed the border, everything behind us turned to black and we were left there with him sobbing softly on the ground and me, panting, standing over him. I could feel his pain and it crushed me. No kid should have to go through this. His sobbing slowly faded and I could feel relief start to overtake the desperation and fear he was feeling. I knelt down beside him and put my hands on his back. I was able to catch my breath. I told you not to look at them. I tried to say something light, but I'm not sure if that was the right thing as he shot around and stared at me. He didn't say anything, but I knew he was angry. I sighed and helped him to his feet. Can I rest for a moment, please? He pleaded with me. I'm sorry, but no. We have a while to go before the next trial and I promise you'll be feeling better by then. I was lying and I knew he knew it. He didn't bother looking at me for a while or saying anything. I didn't blame him and my own shame started to fight with his pain in my head. We were almost near the second trial when he finally asked, "What the hell was that?" I looked at him, but didn't break stride. That was the first test. Those were lost souls who refused to repent, but didn't deserve the darkness. Basically they rot and turn into that. It's like limbo, I guess. Would that be me if they dragged me back? No, that would have been much worse. I replied shortly. The less I talked, it seemed to help me control his emotions that I was feeling so. I could feel fear suddenly spike in him and glanced over to see him looking towards the trees that lined the path around us. I knew he was looking at the dark silhouettes that stood in between the trees, but he didn't ask, and again I was trying not to speak as much, so we just kept walking. I stopped when we reached another fork in the path. We have reached our second choice. Would you like to exit, or continue? I asked, gesturing to both paths respectively. Abe didn't hesitate. Test. I smiled proudly. The left path again was thrust into darkness and Abe moved towards the right. Good luck, Abraham, I said before Abe walked into the darkness. I took my spot at the end of the trial and watched nervously as the darkness lifted around Abe and he was immediately hit with a strong gust of wind, forcing him to stagger and brace himself. I felt his fear for a split second, but he quickly regained his confidence as he was able to find his footing and slowly trek forward. Stumbling, I could feel his pain start to lift as the cold air and freezing winds numbed his raw legs. The further along the path he trudged, the stronger the winds became and eventually he had to lean forward to brace himself. I could feel stabbing pain starting to creep back as the cooling effects of the wind started going in the opposite direction on the rest of his body, stinging his skin and eyes. This is one of the shortest trials, but probably takes the longest, and the fact that after about half an hour he was only about 10 feet along was a great testament to that. Eventually, as they all do, Abe leaned about as far forward as he could and stopped moving. I shook slightly from the cold that he was feeling on his own body, a sensation I hadn't felt since my own penance. I attempted, pretty unsuccessfully, to control my slight shiver. While I was focusing on myself, Abe laid down and started crawling with his eyes closed along the ground. I could feel his agony every time he dug his fingers into the almost frozen dirt. He was going a lot slower than standing, but he was moving at a more consistent pace than before. I felt a quick twinge of fear, but I think he was way too cold to feel or think anything. The winds continued to get stronger until he was about 10 feet away from me and I could see him start to slide backwards along the ground. He furiously flailed his hands in front of him and dug even deeper into the hard ground than before. He let out a scream of pain as I could see his fingernails start to lift off of his bloody hands. The progress was much slower and more excruciating, but inch by inch he came to the end. He let out one last defiant roar that sent shivers down my spine and pulled himself the last bit until the path grew dark and he laid on his back at my feet, shivering uncontrollably with his eyes closed. I knelt down next to him and could hear the faintest sobs as a tear forced its way out of his eyelid. My own eyes started to bubble slightly, but I rubbed then and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing amazing, kid." I tried to sound as reassuring and confident as possible, but my voice wavered a bit as his fear and pain overtook me. Abe opened his eyes and stared blankly at the black starless sky that hung above us. If you didn't know any better, you'd think we were in a bottomless pit with no hope of clawing our way to the surface, and I could tell by his stone face still spanked with tears that he was feeling that emptiness and hopelessness. He didn't say anything for a long time and I let him sit with this. As his body thawed, the pain returned to his legs and hands, but to the kid's credit he didn't show it. I could feel his internal agony, but his face was stoic. I looked at the blood streaming from his legs and noticed he was missing a few nails and could do nothing but sigh. I wanted to pick the kid up and carry him. I wanted to help him along, but he needed to be strong to make it through and that wouldn't help. After some time he looked at me and allowed me to help him to his feet. We moved along much slower than before in silence that was suddenly broken by screaming all around us. Abe surged with fear and looked around as a cold sweat started pouring down his face. "What is that?" he asked almost inaudibly, looking at the many more figures that were now standing in the trees. I was too transfixed by Abe's pain to remember the figures at first, but then I snapped out of it. I looked side to side without stopping our progress. Those are souls that were lost to this particular test. They have to stay here for eternity and watch others try to succeed where they failed. That's what would have happened if those creatures on test 1 had pulled you back or if you couldn't make it past the winds. The screams were faint right now, but I knew it would get worse as we moved further in the tests. He was shaking in fear looking around us and was too preoccupied to realize we had gotten to the next fork. I didn't even bother going through my whole thing this time and just nodded to him. Abe exhaled sharply. "Test." He breathed out. I gave his shoulder a squeeze. "You can make it through this, Abraham." I pulled the kid in and kissed the top of his head. "Good luck." As soon as the darkness lifted, ice hit Abe's head without warning. A tremendous hail was pouring down on him from above. He didn't hesitate this time. As soon the cold from this test numbed his raw legs and nailless fingers and he used that to his advantage. I watched with a tentative smile as Abe waited for the cold to take its hold and began to sprint as fast as he could. The hail grew worse as he moved until I knew there was just a wall of white pain in front of him, but he never broke stride and closed his eyes. The more he ran, the more confidence I could feel surge in him, but I couldn't share the feeling, and as soon as a terrible roar cut through the almost deafening sound of hail, that confidence was shattered and he stopped in his tracks. His eyes shot open and then back to a squint as he frantically looked around trying to identify the source of the sound, eventually landing on the giant three-headed creature perched on a throne overlooking the trial. I knew Cerberus wasn't a threat, but I was hoping he didn't shake Abe long enough to impede his progress on this trial. To my relief, Abe slowly continued on again without taking his eyes off the motionless figure. His senses were heightened now and the pain from the hail was starting to make its way to the surface. Without warning, Abe turned back towards me, closed his eyes and sprinted faster than ever. One last roar tore through the air and chased him out, but the path grew dark and Abe stood in front of me, hunched over and panting. I could feel the stinging on his skin and couldn't tell if his slight shiver was from the cold or pain, but I put my hand on his back. "That was fast, man," I said with a sense of pride taking over. "Honestly, one of the fastest I've seen in my time." He looked up at me, still trying to catch his breath, and wordlessly just gestured for us to move on. This is one of the first times in years I felt genuine joy. This kid was strong. I held him back for a second and looked him in the eyes. "It may not seem like it, but you're doing really good right now." I looked for confirmation in his eyes or anything, but I could feel his lack of confidence and it hurt. I bit my lip and sighed. We both looked down and saw the massive collection of welts that joined his torn legs and hands. He started trembling and tearing up as he watched the blood pour down his shins and over his destroyed shoes. I could feel his regret and my stomach began to hurt. I put my arm around his shoulders and began leading him down the path. I went to say something hopefully reassuring, but he interrupted me. "What the hell is a Reaper anyway?" I was a little taken aback by the question. Not that I don't get asked, because I do, but I usually get asked much earlier in the process. Well, the short version is we ferry souls. He cringed a bit as the screaming began around us. I wasn't going to continue, but I knew the kid needed a distraction for a second. When we die, some of us are given this option as penance for our sins. We spend a few hundred or thousand years ferrying souls depending on our sins and then go to heaven. He didn't react to anything I was saying and I knew he didn't care. I wasn't feeling anything from him, which was new. I think he was trying to numb himself. Smart. We came up to the next fork and before I even attempted to speak he yelled, "Right." I sighed and nodded slowly. I didn't bother with the good lucks this time and he didn't look at me, just walked into the darkness. The darkness lifted and Abe looked curiously at the large boulder that stood in front of him. He was still numbing himself, but I could feel curiosity start to peek through. I smirked at the fact that he wasn't afraid. Even when he saw the tiny goblin-like creatures standing around the boulder excitedly jumping around and screeching to themselves the stupid language they speak, he was just curious and nothing else. I saw him flinch in pain as his injuries began to take their toll again. He closed his eyes and hung his head, clenching his fists trying to control himself. As he looked down, the goblins hopped over and dragged him towards the boulder. They strapped a chain around his waist and excitedly laughed and jumped their way back into the trees. His eyes were still closed and he didn't move for a while. I was growing more nervous as I felt the pain radiate worse than ever before. I gave him a few more minutes, trying to suppress the pain that now surged throughout my body. "Fucking go, kid." I managed to scream. This seemed to break his trance and his eyes shot open, looking in my direction a few hundred yards away. He stumbled forward until the rope was taut and stopped. He turned towards the boulder and took a few deep breaths, grabbing the chain with both hands. He yanked as hard as he could and the boulder moved a couple inches. "Fuck." I could hear him mutter, resigned. This trial wasn't that hard, but it was grueling. Honestly, after this one a lot gave up, if they even made it this far, and this is what I feared for Abe. I held my breath, silently cheering for him. Out of nowhere I felt a wave of confidence overtake him as he took his time moving the massive stone. I knew he still felt the pain all over his body, but slowly, very slowly he inched forward. He stopped when the pain was too much, but after maybe 10 yards or so his body began to numb and he could continue on. With the pain gone in his legs he could drive forward with more power and moved a bit faster, but after about half a day of pulling I could feel his confidence wavering. To my disappointment he first sat and then laid down, basically giving up. I was heartbroken. I hung my head and just waited for him inevitably to just pass on. I sat staring at him, not knowing what to do besides playing with the dirt in front of me. We sat like that for 20 minutes or so when out of nowhere he sprung to his feet and I could feel fear surge through him. I didn't know what had prompted this, but I was all for it. I jumped up as well and started yelling for him. He turned his back to me again and pulled and didn't stop pulling this time. I could feel the strain and watched him dig his heels into the ground and pull with everything he had. He let out a few screams and inched his way towards me. His confidence overtook the fear as he moved closer and closer until after a full day was almost at the end of the trial. I reached across the barrier and my hands started burning painfully. I pulled back surprised. I never tried to help a soul before. I hesitated and swallowed as his progress had slowed. I took a deep breath and jumped onto the path. The searing pain forced me to let out a scream that startled Abe, who turned to me and jumped back. I screamed again and grabbed his chain. I saw smoke coming from my arms as we both pulled the last few feet and felt immediate relief when we made it to the other side. This time we both slumped over and panted. I caught my breath first and my body had already started healing, so the burns that had formed on my arms were closing themselves. I let out a little laugh. "I'm not doing that again," I said with a smile and looked up at him, but he wasn't looking back. He looked worse than before, and now on top of the crippling pain, I could feel his utter exhaustion. I limped over to him and put a hand on his shoulder. He wasn't crying, but I knew he wanted to. "If you want to stop, I can carry you." I bent down and whispered in his ear. He took a couple more seconds and a sinking feeling began forming in my gut. I wanted him to refuse, but I've seen this look before. When a soul is done, they're done. The longer he took to answer or even look at me, the worse I felt. With him responding, I went to lift him, but he slapped me away. "I'm not done yet," he said, looking at me with fire and determination that I wasn't expecting. Another shiver went down my spine and I beamed with pride. I grabbed his hand and helped him get fully upright. "You got this, kid," I said, pulling him in for an embrace. His words and eyes gave off confidence and defiance, but I could feel his resignation and fear. I held him for a long time, trying my best to let him heal as best I could. We pulled away and began on our way. The screams were louder now than ever and it was pointless to even try talking. It was better at this stage to conserve energy anyway, and soon we were to the next fork. I didn't ask or gesture. I didn't need a response because I knew our journey together was going to continue. Faint splashing could be heard from the dark right path and I saw him hesitantly look at the shining gold path to the left. He took a couple deep breaths and moved to the right, into the darkness. I took my normal place at the end of the trial and was pleased to see my friend Nunchus standing there waiting for me. "Ducks," he yelled when he saw me and we embraced. "It's been too long, I'm sorry that we're meeting again though." I sighed and told him I shared his sentiments. When the pleasantries were finished, we stared at each other in silent pity for a few moments. "How is yours?" I finally asked. He sighed. "He's a good guy, of course, they all are. But he doesn't have the strength, I know." He let out a deep, sad sigh. "This is his last trial." I clapped a hand on my friend's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. Thankfully this is your last ferry?" I saw his lips quiver, trying to smile, but it wouldn't come. I would have liked to end it by bringing another soul to paradise, but take it from an old veteran, watching good people suffer is still part of the penance. We touched foreheads and stayed silent for a few moments with our eyes closed before I whispered, "My kid is strong." Our eyes opened and I continued, "He's one of the strongest I've had. He's young, but worthy." Nunchus weakly smiled and gave me a knowing nod. "I'm truly sorry for this." We put our arms around each other and looked at the trial. Abe stood on one side of a narrow, decrepit, wooden path sitting about 35 feet above a raging river. On the opposite side of the path stood a man of about 50 who looked to be in worse shape than my Abraham. I looked at Nun and he nodded reluctantly. We turned back and the man looked horrified, while I could see and feel Abe's curiosity as he looked at the tall black waves that almost reached his pier, flinching ever so slightly every time a skinny, decayed hand reached out looking for anyone to raise them from their fate. Abe eventually looked back to the man who was still shaking and looking around in fear. Abe did nothing as the man finally looked to him and they both stood there in confusion, neither knowing what to do. Out of seemingly nowhere during their stare there was a large crack of lightning and in each of their hands an old rusty sword and old wooden shield appeared. I felt Nun tense up in my grasp as the two froze in place as a sense of shock overtook Abe and I knew he knew what was going on. Nervously he looked up to the man, who was staring at the sword and shield with a mixture of fear and shock. I held my breath as Abe looked from the sword to the man and back and then slowly made his way to the other side of the walkway. The man looked up and saw Abe approaching and lifted his sword, but didn't move. Abe picked up speed as he ran forward and let out a scream before swinging down so violently that both Nunchus and I jumped back. The man blocked with his shield but was thrown back to the edge of the walkway. Abe didn't let up and dropped his shield to use both hands to swing down over and over and over onto the man's shield. I could see tears filling his eyes and could feel how afraid he was in this moment. The man kicked him in the gut, sending the small child flying back, and they once again stood staring at each other as the waves below grew higher and higher, starting to soak the moldy, broken boards upon which the two souls sparred. They both let out screams and ran towards each other, swords cocked back ready to strike. Neither were very skilled and simply swung at each other, trying desperately to hit something fleshy. Abe landed the first blow, stabbing the man in the gut. He let out a small cry of pain, but didn't let up on the much smaller soul. Swinging overhead relentlessly, eventually getting Abe with a good jab to the shoulder. The child screamed and dropped his sword off the edge of the platform into the dark water below as a thick stream of blood started pouring out of him. I winced and closed my eyes and only opened them when I felt my friend's hand squeeze my shoulder. Through watery eyes I watched in terror as the kid fell to his back and started crawling backwards away from the man. I fell to my knees as the tears ran down his face and could barely make out his pleas of mercy over the raging waves. Nun knelt down next to me and embraced me hard. We both knew how hard this was, and I know he was not enjoying my misery. Abe scrambled backwards as quickly as he could as the man slowly followed him and raised his sword above his head, bringing it down hard onto Abe's blocking arm, making a clean cut and sending the severed limb tumbling over the edge. Abe and I both let out heart-wrenching screams as I completely fell to the ground and he stopped scrambling, holding his severed appendage. The man had tears running down his face and I felt Nuntius leaning close to my ear. "He's sorry." Abe was rolling in pain as the blood soaked the platform around him. The man hesitated, he was a good man after all, but then raised his sword for one final swipe. As he brought the blade down, the waves finally reached the platform and one of the lost souls in the water found what it was looking for as a decaying hand grabbed the man's ankle and dragged him, screaming in terror, into the waters below. Nuntius and I both sat there, stunned. We had never seen a soul be grabbed. We knew what swam in the Styx, but had never seen them grab another soul. I could still barely stand as Abe now lay writhing in pain, still clutching his severed arm on solid ground. Nuntius let out a breath and looked from Abe and back to me. He didn't say anything and he didn't have to. I nodded my head as my eyes began to tear. He stood up and began to walk away. "I hope to see you in the next phase, my friend," I called weakly after him. He turned and smiled to me, nodding before disappearing into the trees. I weakly crawled over to Abe, who was crying silently on the ground as his arm bled. I didn't say anything at first and laid next to him, not able to take his pain, but just feel it. I wanted to take it. I wanted to take him back and make him go back to his life. It was too late. I managed to get to my feet and he still didn't open his eyes or move. All he did was whisper, "Please carry me." Through tears. I let out an exasperated sigh and nodded, trying to catch my breath before I reached down and scooped up his body. His blood poured down on me as we trudged along slowly and the screaming souls were silent. I felt tears form in my eyes, and for the first time since my own penance they dripped down my face onto the motionless figure that I carried. I was shaking as we finally got to the fork for the 6th trial. I went to speak but was stopped by the sobs that I thought were from Abe but realized were coming from me. I began again as my tears soaked my face. "I don't care that I carried you. You can continue." I looked down at the young face, all but pleading with him to continue on to the light. He looked at me and, coughing up blood, smiled, "No more test ducks." I fell to my knees and dropped him to the ground. I sobbed uncontrollably as he struggled to his feet and turned to hug me. "Thank you." I'm so sorry, Abraham," was all I could muster as I watched the child slowly walk towards the golden path to the left. The path to darkness is paved with gold, but paradise lies beyond pain. I heard him lightly chant to himself as he moved. I smiled slightly as he crossed the barrier, and I watched and felt as his severed arm grew back and felt all his pain vanish as joy filled his heart. He paused just beyond the barrier and I could feel a surge of fear overtake him. I couldn't see what he was seeing, but he turned back screaming and ran towards me before the darkness consumed him and he was gone. I don't have a choice, but to continue with the path that I've chosen. I don't have a choice but to try and be a better ferryman to those who decide to take this path. But please, if you are given the chance, turn back and live your life, take your chances. Something is drawing me back to my hometown. Kids are creepy. I don't think it's really up for debate, and as much as you may not want to admit it, it's true. Kids are creepy, just inherently creepy. Anything in horror can be made exponentially creepier when children get involved, whether it's as the antagonist or the victim. Hello Danny, come and play with us. Still sends shivers down the spines of horror fans decades after the movie for the sheer fact that there's children involved. A serial killer? Boring, played out. A serial killer who targets children? Creepy. A serial killer who is a child? Fucking horrifying. Maybe it has to do with the tainting of something as innocent and pure as a child and seeing them torn from this world or used as a vessel for evil before their lives can even begin. When I say a child killer is creepy, a killer of children that is, it's true for adults, but more so for children themselves. When you first realize there are sick people out there who would be more than willing to end your life. That coupled with not really having a firm grasp on the world as a whole, so it's even more difficult to wrap your tiny brain around anything other than the notion of stranger danger and steer clear of white vans. It's something that can quickly shatter your innocence, specifically if it happens in your town. I grew up in a small New Jersey town, a suburb if you will, complete with a relatively thick wood while also being 15 minutes outside of the city. A quiet town. A peaceful town. Me and my friends were given a lot of freedom when we were younger. We walked home from school by ourselves, we'd wander the woods, sometimes alone, at all times at night and just generally do shit that you just don't see kids get away with anymore. And this was before cell phones. They existed, I'm not that old, but for a kid my age they were very few and far in between. For example, I got my first one when I was 10 and lost it because I never used it, so I didn't care. Mentioning that you don't see kids out at all times of night by themselves is true for all places, but mainly my old town. In fact, after I turned 11 you wouldn't have found me or my friends out and about either. For a time, we had no idea why. One day I came home from school to find my mom frantically talking on the phone without even turning to acknowledge my return. When she finally did, she ran and embraced me without saying a word. Me being a super cool 11-year-old, I pulled away quickly. "You're getting picked up from now on," was all she said, her eyes welling up slightly, before running to another room and pounding on the phone. It was weird. I didn't know what it meant, but when I told my friends the next day they said their parents had said the same thing. We didn't think much of it, our preteen minds just angry that our parents were putting restrictions on us, not really understanding that there may be another reason. Besides, we could just hang out with our friends another time, right? Yeah, not really. A few kids went missing that year. They were a few years older, 13 I think, and I didn't really know them so I wasn't too concerned about it. We of course didn't take it seriously, making up stories about aliens and monsters that eventually became gospel among our little groups. Our parents did their best to put a stop to it, telling us the far-fetched tale of the kids simply running away from home. We weren't buying it. There were always tall tales and legends in my town. Our elementary school was haunted, the woods surrounding it was home to a sadistic murderer, and don't even get me started on the large abandoned building that we all knew for a fact was home to an insane asylum where the doctors performed cruel, dangerous experiments. These new disappearances just added to the town's lore that we knew in our hearts was all real. That summer I was home from school, obviously, and my parents worked so they couldn't really stop me from going outside on my own. All the stories and legends in the world weren't enough to stop me and my friends from continuing to brave the woods alone or wander the streets, while our parents were at work of course. Because at the end of the day, even if we believed the stories, which we did, they were just that, stories. None of us knew the kids that went missing, none of us knew anyone from the asylum, or a victim of the murderers that lurk in the shadows, though we would claim to know a cousin or close friend who fell prey to the many horrors. My brother and I had an agreement: when my parents were at work, I'd sneak out, he'd keep his mouth shut about it. It worked perfectly for both of us because he was older, he had just turned 13, and in his mind was too cool to be bothered by his baby brother. This particular day, like most days, I was going to meet one of my best friends who lived through the woods. I'd venture across the small stream that ran through the trees on my own, expertly finding the stable stones that would keep me dry. It was muscle memory at this point. I could do it in the dark, with my eyes closed. There weren't too many animals that lived in my area. Deer of course, though they were still pretty rare, then every once in a while maybe a fox or a coyote scare, but that was about it. Let's just say nothing big enough to pose a real threat, except the hidden monsters and aliens naturally. We had nothing planned to do when I gathered my friend, but he suggested going to the town's old quarry, which was a pretty popular spot to just walk area and bullshit when there was nothing else to do. Now, if you haven't gotten the sense yet, I was a decently fearless kid, but there was something about the quarry that never felt right. For starters, I wasn't the biggest fan of heights, so essentially standing atop a cliff overlooking a few 100-foot drop wasn't my idea of a good time, but even the woods near the bottom, there was just something not right. I don't know exactly, but I eventually relented. I was the one who saw it first. I wasn't too sure of what it was at first glance, but as we got closer fear started to bubble in my stomach. Blood, almost just red moss about 10 feet up on a trunk. If you weren't looking it would have been so easy to miss, but now that I had seen it I couldn't look away. It was a single stain about a foot, maybe a foot and a half across and the same height-wise, but that wasn't the issue was the placement. It was too high. If it was lower then maybe a deer ran into the tree, maybe a coyote got a hold of something, but 10 feet up, there was nothing that could cause it. My body went numb as we approached it, closer and closer, until we were about 5 feet from the tree. "What the heck?" I heard my friend mumble in almost a whisper. It wasn't a question, and I didn't have an answer. His eyes were transfixed to the spot and I could tell he was trying, and failing, to keep his cool. He backed away slowly, but I couldn't move. I wanted to, but something was forcing me to stay. No, something in the back of my mind was telling me to stay put. I slowly raised my eyes from the stain further up the tree until all I could see was the leaves gently rustling. A low hum seemed to emanate from the quarry wall and the rustling grew more frantic until I felt a hand slap down hard on my shoulder, breaking me out of my trance. I jumped and spun to see my friend's terror-stricken eyes looking into mine. Without a word we sprinted back the way we had come and parted ways. I got home a little later and a little more shaken up than I would have liked. Still early enough for my parents to not be home, but late enough that a bit of an early day for them could have fucked up my week. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the driveway clear. I had enough excitement for one day. I got to my front door and pushed it open, but paused before stepping through. I had pushed it open, not turned the knob, just pushed. I froze in place. A sick tingling shot from my head down into my feet as I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours. A low hum started up behind me from the direction of the woods. Again I couldn't move, it was like my feet were nailed to the ground. I broke my own trance this time, forcing my way into the threshold. The hum stopped as soon as I started moving. I nervously called my brother's name, but got no response. He didn't care if I left the house, but he wasn't one to leave himself. I called again, nothing. The house felt normal. It's a weird thing to say I guess, but it's true. After the shit that happened in the last hour or so, that was huge. Timidly I wandered the empty house, gaining more confidence with every vacant corner I searched. I was starting to think it was a stupid prank, also not something my brother was apt to do, but people could surprise you. I began feeling a lot better with this thought running through my mind and even started searching with a smile splashed across my face. It dropped though when I went in my parents' room. They had a large vanity mirror across from their bed and on it was written one word in red. Bye. My mother's scream sounded like they were miles away though she was a few feet from me. I saw her and my father rushing around, but everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. Bye burning into my mind. A hum filled my head and became deafening until it drowned out the sound of my mother yelling into the phone and my father calling my brother's name over and over. The next year or so was a nightmare. At this point over 50 kids from our town had gone missing, including my brother. There was no connection besides them all being 13 and the fact that no body or trace was ever found of any of them. Oh yeah, and they all wrote bye in big red letters on a mirror in their house before they vanished. That's all there was. That's all I knew at least. My mom was a fucking mess. I can still feel the pain of seeing her. She was a shell, just going through the motions. For months she did everything she could, but then she gave up. One day she came inside from searching and sat on the couch and stayed there. She barely ate or slept, she was barely alive at that point. My dad was in pain too, I could see it, but this made him tighten his grip on me. He didn't say it, but my birthday was coming up, my 13th. No one knew what it meant really, but there were some major changes in the town. If you thought there was a lockdown before then you were in for it. Most kids, myself included, started getting homeschooled. My dad quit his job and found one that he could do remotely so I was never out of his sight. And as my birthday grew nearer and nearer things got worse to the point where we were sleeping in the same room. I was shaken up too. I loved my brother, even if I would never admit it to anyone because I was young, but I used to cry myself to sleep every night. I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I couldn't even really understand why the age mattered, but no one close to me had ever died. We didn't know he was dead at the time, but he might as well have been. It had been a while since I heard anything about disappearances. My brother was the last one I had heard of and I wasn't sure if that meant he was the last or my parents just didn't care about the others anymore. I knew my mom didn't. Eventually my birthday came and went exactly the way any 13-year-old wants to spend it, alone with your dad as your mom sits in a catatonic state on the couch. Not that I blame her now, but I did then. I was furious. I understood why those kids ran away if they did. She lost a son, but she still had one that needed her. I didn't get it. I was a dumb kid. My birthday was uneventful, but after that the dreams started. They were nothing at first, just darkness. A few days of that and then the darkness was filled with a low hum that gradually grew louder and louder. Soon enough the hum was joined by sickening crunches and slurps, but it was still pitch black. I would shoot up in bed in a cold sweat, the hum still in the back of my mind. Most of the time my father would be sitting up near me in the dark and make sure everything was okay. I said it was and I assume he just thought it was stress about my brother. Unfortunately the progression of the dreams wasn't done. The humming and crunching would crescendo into a deafening bombardment of sound and as soon as it started it ended and I was thrown into complete silence and darkness. I couldn't wake up at this point and when the silence came I was hurtled out of the darkness towards a bare ground. Faster and faster I'd fall and then right before hitting the ground I'd see something rustle the leaves in the bushes. Then I was awake. It was morning. The sun was shining. And the humming was incessant for a couple of days. This last sequence happened and the humming was be louder every day I woke up. I wanted to tell my dad, but I didn't want to be annoying. My brother's birthday was coming up and he was getting angry more often than usual. One night, the dream was different. I was in darkness and then all of a sudden I was sitting on my parents' bed staring into the mirror. My reflection blankly staring back at me. I couldn't move, all I could do was stare into the reflection until I could swear it was moving. And then it did. Its head tilted slightly to the side and looked at me like a confused puppy. Its movements were too slow to be natural, ignoring the fact that I was still motionless. We stayed in that position in complete silence for an eternity. I could feel myself breathing heavily as I tried desperately to will myself to move, but nothing happened, which only added to my distress. As I grew more and more agitated, I saw a sick smile creep across the face of my doppelganger. It was too wide. I thought his head was going to split in half as the line across his face reached completely cheek to cheek. I gasped in horror and could feel tears forming in my eyes as red liquid began to seep slowly from his face. When I reached a full sob, he dabbed a little of his own blood on his finger and began to write on the mirror. A hum filled the air so loud it made my eyes hurt, and through my blurred eyes I watched him write, "Bye." I woke up at the quarry. On top of the quarry. It was early morning and the light was blinding, but I was more concerned with the hum that made my ears feel like they were bleeding. I tried to cover them with my hands, but I was frozen again. I don't know what it was, but it was that thing in the back of my head again telling me to stay put. I looked around frantically and saw a few kids from town standing there, and I realized we were in a single file line, going to the drop off the quarry wall. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to scream, but my mouth felt like it was sewn shut. I saw a tall dark figure step out from behind a pile of rocks, and the humming, if it was possible, grew louder as he approached. He was too tall, he was too skinny, and his features were too, I don't know. He wore a black hat. Like you used to see on old-timey gangsters, over shoulder length, pitch black hair that covered most of his face and only letting a sliver of gray skin peek through, along with a too wide smile that threatened to splint his face in two. He slunk over to the line of kids and stopped at the boy in front. A kid I had seen around but never really talked to. The man or the monster or whatever stooped over and looked the kid up and down before, without warning, the kid took a step forward and off the cliff face. A few heart-pounding seconds went by where everything seemed to freeze, but a sickening crunch and squish broke the frozen state. Tears were running down my face and I could barely make out the rustling of leaves as I instinctively stepped forward. 4 kids between me and the drop. My heart sank lower than it already was when I saw who was up next. My best friend. I tried everything I could to shake free of whatever had a hold of me and could start to feel myself wiggle slightly. The figure turned to me as I did, and his smile seemed to get wider as he looked from my friend to me and back. The hum subsided for a second and I thought I almost heard a laugh in the back of my head as my friend took one last step forward. Without the hum dulling it, I could almost feel the crunch in my gut, and I could hear the rustling more distinctly, followed by a low growl and more crunching than another rustle. I was able to let out a scream, I think, but at any rate I went back to having my mouth shut tight. And the figure now refused to look away from me. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I could feel them burning into me. 3 left. I couldn't bear any more after him. I craved for the hum to come back, but it didn't. I had to hear every gut-wrenching crunch and splat. I think the figure knew I was breaking free and wanted to destroy me before destroying me. Who would do this? What was this? I needed to know. But I couldn't speak. Then before I knew it, it was down to 1 kid before me, a girl I'd never seen. The figure kept his eyes towards me. I felt myself moving forward before the girl took her step. I was able to move my head to look at her, to see tears streaming down her face. Her lips were quivering and I could tell she was trying to close her eyes, but she couldn't. Whatever the fuck this was wasn't letting her. It wanted us to suffer, it wanted us to feel the fear. I tried to reach out to her but I couldn't, and then I did hear laughter. I know I did. I tried to swing my head to look at the figure, but instead it dropped, so I was looking straight down. Straight down at a small clearing stained red, surrounded by rustling bushes. Suddenly the girl's body fell into my view and I wasn't able to look away as I watched her hit the ground and her body crumble like a bag of sticks. I managed to throw up over the edge as I watched the blood pool around the limp mass of flesh and bone. Then the rustling grew faster and I saw what this was all about. A brownish-green creature rushed out towards what was left of the girl's body at the base of the wall. Its 6 scorpion-like legs propelled it forward with alarming speed, and its giant's pincers greedily tore into the pile of meat, lifting it swiftly to the mouth full of what I can assume were razor-sharp teeth on its long thin head as half a dozen more of the creatures came storming out of the brush until there was no evidence the girl was there. I couldn't really tell from my vantage point, but it looked like they had no eyes. I stood there in stunned horror and felt my head slowly turning toward the menacing figure who was now standing over me. I knew he wanted to put on a show for me in particular, that's why all the creatures came out at once. Some sadistic show. The world was silent as I felt myself turn back towards the edge. My heart was beating out of my chest, but I was out of tears. I tried to close my eyes, though I knew I couldn't. I started praying as I felt my leg move over the edge, but then it stopped as a loud bang sounded from behind me. I realized I could move slightly and turned to watch the figure spin to look towards the back of the line. A thick black liquid pouring from its neck. I turned fast enough to watch a few policemen rushing forward with their guns raised. The figure didn't make a sound. It just slowly turned back to me. I expected to see fear or anger or something on its face, but the smile that it wore sent a chill down my spine that stayed with me for the years to follow. I heard more bangs and watched the monster jerk violently and then fall off the side of the quarry. I didn't want to look down. But I heard a crunch, a rustle, and then silence. For years I was fucked up, and then it passed. My mom eventually passed away, and that snapped me out of my own trauma. My dad and I put together the pieces as well as we could after that, and for a while we were happy. We never really talked about what happened to me, because how could we? I didn't know what the fuck actually happened, and even what I did know was too crazy. The police just thought it was some lunatic who was shot and killed during the rescue. We went back to living our lives, and our town went back to being our town. Eventually we moved away, and that place, those faces, that trauma was erased from my mind. For years it was gone. It's amazing how little fucking things can jog your memory though. I saw a missing kid the other day. The first one I'd seen in years. Thoughts came flooding back like an unstoppable wave. A surge went through me and paralyzed my whole body. I don't know what it is or why it does that, but it's doing it now. That's why I'm writing this, though I honestly don't know what good will come from it, because I'm not going to give you the town, I'm not going to give you the names or the kids. But I just hear that fucking humming all the time now. It just started again and I can't get it out of my head.